Okay, so Moriav agus Biomathabiv as oft for Coluger agus Catholic Memo Buifus of all Corla Hunde Limni as oft on Corashop. Kind ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for tuning in, and thank you as well to Limerick Council for giving me this opportunity to speak. Pádraig Ó Ruairc is my name, and I'm going to be talking to you about the battle for Limerick City during the Civil War in July of 1922, but I'm also going to give a brief overview of some of the other key events in Limerick City and County during that period. So the first slide I have up here on screen is actually the Gaeltacht Hotel, still in operation in Limerick, and this was it during the so-called Limerick crisis, which I'll talk about in a minute, of March 1922. Now, so the Limerick crisis in March 1922, what was happening is that after the treaty had been signed, as the IRA was splitting into pro-treaty and anti-treaty factions, and as politicians and the people were debating over the treaty, there was basically a British withdrawal from what was to become the Irish Free State. So first of all, the British Army were removed from their barracks, along with the RIC in large towns and in rural areas. A lot of them were consolidated in Dublin before being disbanded or being sent to the north or back to Britain. There was an agreement in place that when the British withdrew from a barracks or from an area, they would hand it over to whoever the local IRA unit were. It did not matter whether that IRA unit was taking an anti-treaty or a pro-treaty position and therefore turning into the Free State Army. It was just supposed to hand over the barracks to the local unit. The one place where this agreement did not happen and that was broken was in Limerick City in March of 1922, sparking the so-called Limerick crisis. What happened was that the Limerick City Brigade, the Mid-Limerick Brigade of the IRA, had adopted an anti-treaty position. So the new provisional government of the Irish Free State basically ordered the East Clare Brigade of the IRA, led by Michael Brennan, which had taken the pro-treaty side, to come in to Limerick City as the British were evacuating and to take control of places like King John's Castle, then known as the Castle Barracks, or to take over places like the new barracks, what today we would know as Sarsfield Barracks. And what happened was an agreement was reached between the British and the pro-treaty side that they would hand over the barracks to them, and all of this was done without the knowledge of the anti-treaty IRA. And what happened was when the pro-treaty side came in and took over these barracks, anti-treaty forces from other areas, from Tipperary, from Cork, from Kerry, started pouring into Limerick City. And it actually looked in March and April of 1922 that the Civil War was going to start in Limerick. Remember, there's no actual fighting in the Civil War at this stage yet. But eventually, the pro-treaty side decided to back down, and the pro-treaty troops under Michael Brennan's command are evacuated from Limerick City and return to back to County Clare and to Galway. So when fighting does actually happen in the Irish Civil War, it starts, of course, in Dublin with the shelling of the forecourts by the pro-treaty side. The map that you're seeing now on this slide is outlines the position that the anti-treaty side were in Limerick. So at the beginning of the fighting in the Civil War, they control completely the city. So they have the Castle Barracks, which I mentioned. They have the new barracks, or Sarsfield Barracks. There was the Ordnance Barracks, which is up by what is now the Horse and Hound pub. There were various police barracks or RIC stations which had been evacuated. Places like the George Hotel have been commandeered as well by the anti-treaty IRA and the Gaeltacht Hotel. So basically, initially when the fighting begins in Dublin, the anti-treaty IRA are in complete control of the city. But when the Civil War begins in Dublin, that night, the night of the 28th of June 1922, the Free State forces under Michael Brennan again flood back into the city. And you see on this slide, the areas highlighted in blue and the buildings circled are the ones that were taken over by the Free State, the pro-treaty side. So they took over places like the Town Hall. They took over places like William Street, RIC Barracks, what I think today is the Gleeson Sports Store. That actually just had a caretaker from the Board of Works. The anti-treaty IRA hadn't bothered to garrison it. They also took over places like St. Joseph's Hospital, Limerick Prison, and even places like St. Michael's Church and St. Mary's Church, the Church of Ireland Church, were taken over as well. So what that basically does, when they come into the city at night time, the Free State Army, they drive a wedge, as you can see here in the maps. They divide out, they separate and block off all the different anti-treaty positions, which were really around the edges of the city mostly. And in one swoop, the pro-treaty side, the Free State, take control of the city centre. Now, initially, there is no fighting. It's the two sides are squaring off to each other. The anti-treaty IRA have been taken completely by surprise. And a standoff develops because immediately, as soon as he's come into the city, Michael Brennan starts trying to negotiate with the anti-treaty IRA. And remember, they've reached a peaceful agreement whereby he withdrew from the city before. And this gives you an idea of what Limerick City looked like at the time. You can see here a barricade made out of mail bags and what looked like bags of potatoes and things thrown up across Rockland Street in Limerick. You can see here an improvised barricade where you've got Free State soldiers on the pro-treaty side, and they're using, again, whatever is to hand. You can even see it, they have somebody's kitchen table that they've commandeered, and they've piled up sods of turf in front of it, hoping that this will make the barricade more bulletproof. I doubt it somehow. Probably just makes it more flammable. But you can also see the pro-treaty soldiers aren't very well armed. There's 4 guys here with guns, but only 3 of them have modern British Army Lee Enfield rifles. The 4th guy has what looks like a .22 rifle, which was the kind of thing that Boy Scout would have carried at the time. And the 5th guy isn't showing any weaponry. So again, when the pro-treaty side come in, they're not that well armed. This is another pro-treaty barricade. I think this is on the Charleville Road out of Limerick. And you can see that they're basically using whatever sandbags or whatever bags they can to build up the barricade. And for any GAA fans, you'll notice the graffiti that they've written on their barricade to name it. They've called it Hill 60, which was the old name, of course, for Hill 16 in Dublin. So these clearly were, sports fans. So what happens when the Civil War is breaking out is that you have 700 anti-treaty IRA volunteers. They're mostly local men from Limerick City and the surrounding areas. But you also have very experienced IRA veterans from Cork who've come in to support them as well. So 700 anti-treaty IRA, very experienced and well armed. And they're facing off against 400 Free State soldiers. Now, they're mostly members of the East Clare and Galway IRA from the War of Independence, so they've quite a good bit of experience, but maybe not as much as the Cork guys, not as well armed. Their numbers as well have been bolstered by a lot of raw recruits, some of whom hadn't taken any part in the War of Independence itself and would have had very little military experience. And this was something Free State officers commented on later. Brennan, as I said, gets into negotiations with Liam Lynch, who is the anti-treaty IRA leader in the city, and he bluffs using what I call beau geste tactics, if you're familiar with his story in the French Foreign Legion. Brennan has 400 men, but he only has about 150 rifles when he takes over the city. So he comes up with some very clever ruses. So he does things like he gets drain pipes and he has them dismantled, and he would shove the end of the drain pipe out the window and put some sandbags around it of the buildings he had occupied. And to anybody passing by in the street, that drain pipe would have looked like the muzzle of a Lewis machine gun. So he was trying to, again, bluff the anti-treaty IRA into thinking that he was more heavily armed, that he had better weapons, when in fact I don't think he had any machine guns when he initially entered the city. Also, he had this trick of recycling rifles. So he would have 50 pro-treaty soldiers, Free State soldiers, get on the railway station in Cratloe in County Clare, and they'd all be armed with modern, British Army rifles. And as soon as they'd arrive in Limerick Station, he'd have them march out through the city with their 50 rifles and then report into William Street RIC barracks. And as soon as they arrived there, those 50 soldiers would be disarmed The rifles would be put in a lorry, secreted back out to Cratloe railway station, and another 50 soldiers would be issued the same guns and again would take the same route. So when the IRA's intelligence were looking at this, they kept thinking, oh, 1 o'clock, 50 soldiers arrived from Cratloe fully armed. 3 o'clock, another 50 soldiers arrived fully armed. So Brennan basically is giving the impression that his troops are flooding into the city, and what he's doing is just very cleverly maneuvering his men and their rifles around to give the appearance of greater numbers. Why Brennan is doing this is he's waiting on reinforcements from Dublin. He knows he can't hold the city if he's attacked. So he buys time by negotiating with Liam Lynch. And this basically continues until the Free State forces arrive from Dublin to support Brennan. And this was Brennan's quote on it. You can see him here pictured in King John's Castle. And he says, quote, "The holding of Limerick was key to the holding of the whole south and west. My whole fright was that Liam Lynch would attack me before the guns turned up, because we couldn't last. I had to keep him talking to keep him from attacking. We met all together about a dozen times. We used to meet in the presbytery of the Augustinian church, where we argued and argued and argued." So basically, he keeps these negotiations going to hold on time. Now, Liam Lynch's hope in all of this was, if you could get Michael Brennan to go neutral, it would give him, or to come over to the anti-treaty side, or else to stay out of the conflict. It would give him it would give him total control of Limerick, and it would allow him total control of Munster, and then he could start marching on Dublin. That was Lynch's plan, but of course it wasn't to be. Now, one very interesting story from this time is relates to a guy called Jack Munday. Now, who was Jack Munday? Well, there is, of course, a coffee house named after him in Tolmangate in Limerick today. The story of Jack Munday is very interesting in that when the Free State side came into Limerick at the beginning of the Civil War, one of the buildings they took control of was Limerick Prison. And they went from, cell to cell and basically checked who was in it, because again, they were looking for maybe their political opponents or various people. And they slid back the peephole in one cell door, and they saw an African guy inside. And this, obviously, a person of colour being in Limerick in 1922 would have been somewhat unusual. So they went and inquired from this guy, "Who are you and what are you here for?" So the guy was named Jack Munday. He was from Ghana, and he had been a sailor. Now, he had sailed into Limerick as an engineer on a ship during the period between the end of the War of Independence and the start of the Civil War. And there was a military tradition, or there was a naval tradition at the time, that when your ship was leaving port, you would fly the flag of the country you were leaving as a mark of friendship. So as Jack Munday's ship was sailing from Limerick docks, they raised the Irish tricolour. This annoyed a group of black and tans and British soldiers who boarded the boat and tried to seize the flag. Now, a knife fight broke out during which Jack Munday actually stabbed 2 of the black and tans. And for this crime, he was taken and he was put into Limerick prison. But what happened was, of course, the British had evacuated. They had left Jack Munday behind. His case had never been heard in the courts. And when the Free State soldiers discovered him, they said, "Well, look, we have no issue with what you did. We killed plenty of black and tans." And they basically said that you're free to go. But as a man of colour, he was somewhat of an oddity in Limerick at a very unusual and tense time. So they asked him, "What did you do on the ship?" He said, "Well, I was an engineer." And they said, "Well, we need engineers in the Free State Army. Why don't you enlist?" And he did. And actually, he served in the Free State Army during the Civil War. He ended up Gaelicising his name by chasing its Irish. He went from Jack Munday to being Joseph de Lewin. And he actually married and lived in Clonmel for a number of years and left the Free State Army in 1937. So again, we might think of it, or some people might think that it was unusual to have people of colour in Limerick City or County 100 years ago, but maybe not that unusual. Now, when the fighting actually begins to talk about one of the casualties, Fianna Éireann was the Republican scout movement that had been started by Constance Markovich, the Protestant Republican leader and trade unionist. And one of their scouts was killed during the fighting in Limerick City. He was a guy called Michael Moynihan. He was 19 years old and he was killed on dispatch duty. So what these Fianna scouts would have been doing was running from basically from Republican outpost to Republican outpost, and they would have been delivering messages. And he was shot by a Free State sniper on the 15th of July. And what happened was that the anti-treaty IRA, if they were short of sandbags, would hang up blankets inside the windows. And the idea was that if a bullet passed through a window, it would hit the blanket, would lose a lot of power. And then when it hit the second or third blanket, it basically would be taken out of action. And what happened was that Michael Moynihan, when delivering a dispatch, wanted to see some of the fighting, and he pulled back the blankets like pulling black curtains to look out of the window, and that's when he was spotted by a Free State sniper and shot and killed. So most of the fighting in Limerick City happens around the Strand barracks, which is in Thomond Gate. And what you have is this is the group of anti-treaty IRA guys who were garrisoning the Strand barracks. And you can see Connie Mackey here on the seated on the right of the slide, and he was commanding that garrison. And he declared that he would not surrender while he had ammo during the fighting. And the Free State side made several attempts to get into that position. So when the fighting breaks out, Michael Brennan knows it's a key position, and he's sending armoured cars up, and they're raking the building with machine gun fire. He's sending Free State soldiers with grenades to try and, basically fight their way in. And again and again, Mackey's men keep holding out. And you can actually see in the buildings adjacent to it, if you walk along that strand up towards the Curragower pub, you can actually see the bullet holes in the building like the one here. And again, if you look at the close-up of the damage, I mean, to me as a historian, this rivals any of the battlefield archaeology that you can see in Cork or the bullet holes in the GPO in Dublin. It's amazing to see 100 years later, these bullet holes. Eventually what happens is that Limerick City is, of course, captured by the pro-treaty side, the Free State Army, when artillery arrives down from Dublin. Fighting in Dublin, of course, ends in early July. The machinery, or the artillery, is transported across the country with reinforcements. And basically, artillery is what decides the battle. And again, most of the fighting, apart from in the city centre streets, was around the Strand barracks. And you can see this is the damage that the artillery actually did to that building. It blew huge holes in it. And Mackey and his men eventually were forced to surrender, because if they stayed sitting in the building, they would have been pounded to atoms. And the guns were actually being fired from the area where Arthur's Quay is today. They were being used at less than point-blank range. The Free State soldiers had to actually open the breech of the gun and look straight down the barrel in order to aim them. And artillery was not designed for use at that close range. So it did tremendous damage. And once the Strand barracks, the anti-treaty IRA, they're surrendered, suddenly all the Republicans realised that artillery was being used and that they had no way of holding out, because the artillery had been given to the pro-treaty side by the British Army. The anti-treaty IRA didn't have any artillery to fight back with. So they decided they were leaving Limerick City, but they were not going to simply hand over the barracks in Limerick to their opponents. So what they did was they actually set fire to the barrack building inside King John's Castle. And here you can actually see the smoke rising from it, I think, on the 21st of July, 22. Of course, they also burnt the other buildings they were occupying, Sarsfield Barracks, or the new barracks as was known then. Here again, you can see it as a burnt out shell, and these would have been the first pro-treaty troops to come in and occupy it. But again, they had to basically camp out there for the first few months because the buildings had been destroyed. And this is one of the Cork IRA leaders, Tom Kelleher, who had been part of Tom Barry's very famous flying column during the War of Independence. And these were his comments on the situation in Limerick. He said, "We were in a tight situation in the end, and when retreat became inevitable, and when it did come, it resembled a stampede. We fell back through a dare, finally ending up in Butterfoot. We felt hopelessly disillusioned and disheartened. The whole flaming struggle seemed to be leading nowhere." So the IRA at this stage has abandoned Limerick City, and they're just, adrift. And even when the anti-treaty IRA leaves Limerick, some of them go south to Kilmallock, some of them go west to Adair. They're all broken up. It's chaotic. And just to give a very brief outline of the fatalities in Limerick, 11 civilians were killed in the fighting, 6 Free State soldiers, 6 IRA volunteers, and one Fianna Éireann scout who had been assisting the anti-treaty IRA. So these three men here were to the right of the slide. These were the three officers who basically led the campaign to capture Limerick. Michael Brennan, you can see here on the right, is closest to the camera, smoking a cigarette. Beside him, the guy in the V-necked collar, this is General W.R.E. Murphy. He had actually not been in the IRA during the War of Independence, but had been headhunted basically by Michael Collins to come into the new Free State Army. But it's very interesting, the uniform he's wearing is actually an IRA uniform from the War of Independence period. So they must have been quite short in supplies and were recycling old uniforms. And then the last man in the center of the image, this is General Owen O'Duffy, who actually, you'll notice that he had come down from the fighting in Dublin. And if you see his left hand, you'll notice his index finger is missing. Now, O'Duffy used to always tell people afterwards that he had lost it in a shootout with the Black and Tans, but he had actually shot off his own finger when drunk one night. So something interesting to look out for in pictures of Owen O'Duffy. So the battle for Kilmallock, I suppose, was the next big event, and there would be other historians like John O'Callaghan who would have far more information than I on this, but just to give a brief overview, you can see a picture here of a wounded soldier being treated during the fighting. What happened there was why Kilmallock was picked. Well, really the anti-treaty IRA, a lot of them who were leaving Limerick were Corkmen, and they were heading back towards areas they were familiar with, and Kilmallock was really the first large town they met on the road back to Cork. They also had the idea that because Kilmallock is a town down in a valley surrounded by hills, that it would be very easy to protect if they could just keep control of the hilltops. What's interesting is when the pro-treaty side, the Free State, followed them down, General R.E. Murphy is in charge, and he orders the Free State soldiers to actually dig trenches, to dig in their positions, like the First World War. And it appears to be the only place in the Irish Civil War that you actually have trench fighting along the lines of, you know, what you would have seen on the Western Front, though obviously nowhere near as severe. And this map from the Atlas of the Irish Revolution in UCC gives an idea of the IRA positions, that the Free State very quickly, you know, put, what would you call it, basically surround the northern outskirts of the town, get their artillery in position, and of course they can just shell the IRA off the high ground they're holding. So when the Free State Army actually end up marching into Kilmallock, the anti-treaty IRA have totally absconded. What happened was that there had been Free State landings of coastal landings in Kerry and in Limerick, and the anti-treaty IRA volunteers from Kerry and Limerick, or sorry, from Kerry and in Cork, when the IRA volunteers from these areas heard about the Kerry landing in Cork, IRA immediately said, we've got to get back to Cork. They're going to try the same tactic there. So all the Cork and Kerry fighters had evacuated. The Limerick guys knew they couldn't hold it on their own. So when the Free State eventually marched into Kilmallock, completely challenged. And again, you can see here images of what one of these coastal landings looked like, and really it's the Kerry landings that lead to the abandonment of Kilmallock. Here we can actually see from a British Pathé newsreel, 4th of August 1922, this is what the fighting would have looked like, the artillery guns being used. And essentially what happens is the anti-treaty IRA go, there's artillery being used, we have no way to fight this, they just decide to retreat. The fatalities in Kilmallock, you have 7 Free State soldiers killed, 6 IRA volunteers, and 1 civilian. So very briefly, we'll look at the fighting in Adair, which was the 4th of August 1922. This truck, which was commandeered from the Cleves milk factory in Limerick, our condensed milk factory. It's a steam-powered truck, which I think was a bit unusual or outdated even for that time. And you can see Free State soldiers standing in the back of it with an artillery piece that they've somehow managed to hoist up onto it. So that's actually how they move their artillery around. Normally, let's say on the Western Front, it would have been horses, would have been the hitching these things. So there's only 1 fatality in the fighting in Adair. Again, it's the same tactics used by the Free State Army. They start using artillery to bomb the Republican position. And that 1 fatality is Margaret Hartney. Now, she was a member, she was one of, I think, 4 or 5 members of Commonwealth who were killed on the anti-treaty side during the Irish Civil War. So coming among the IRA's Women Auxiliary, Margaret Hartney was operating a Red Cross or first aid post in the Dunraven's Arm Hotel when the building was shelled. And the Free State Army issued a statement afterwards. They didn't know about her death, but they said, quote, all the rooms in the building were found to be bespattered with blood, showing there must have been fairly severe casualties amongst the irregulars, end quote. And really what it is, you know, artillery came to the building. It, you know, would have killed her instantly, causing horrific damage and wounded several others. And that's why the rooms were bespattered with blood. And you can see here a memorial card for Margaret Hartney, who is buried in Mount St. Lawrence Cemetery. And again, it's very interesting that there were 2 commandement fatalities in the War of Independence period, whereas there were 4 in the Civil War. So women were very much on the front lines, even more actively engaged in support for the IRA during the Civil War than they were. It was much more dangerous work than during the War of Independence. So Newcastle West, I think, which would be the county town or the capital of County Limerick, was captured on the 7th of August 1922. This is the Desmond Castle in Newcastle West, now managed by the OPW and open as a tourist site. And that was occupied by the anti-treaty IRA. It had previously been held by the Warwickshire Regiment of the British Army. And again, the Free State side started using artillery to shell that building. And one of the IRA volunteers, Edward O'Dwyer from Limerick City, was killed in action. He went out to the castle domain, the parkland to the north of the castle, and was attempting to fight the Free State troops there, stopping them, putting artillery into position. But what happened was he was shot dead there. And you can actually see this memorial, which is probably the earliest Civil War memorial in the country. It was made by a local butcher, and it's simply someone dug a cross shape into the onto the spot, into the ground where he had been killed, filled it with concrete, and then as the concrete was setting, the butcher took apart his rosary beads, and he, you can see, has E. O'Dwyer, R.I.P. made with beads of the rosary beads, and has his crucifix from the end of the rosary beads embedded as well. And it's amazing to see that that is still there 100 years later. And here's a photograph of Edward O'Dwyer. Now, O'Dwyer's brother is also killed, Dennis O'Dwyer. And this is a memorial just to the south of Newcastle West. This was as the Republicans were evacuating the castle once the shelling continued. Again, it was the same scenario. They set fire to it, retreated south towards Cork. And Dennis O'Dwyer, who you can see here, was killed. Now, he appears to have been captured and summarily executed or shot on the spot. This is a memorial card for them, and their sister later made a pension claim about her bereavement, and this is what she said, quote, at Newcastle West, Limerick, on the 7th of August 1922, my brother, Edward O'Dwyer, was killed in action. My other brother, Dennis, was murdered after being taken prisoner. He was put up against the wall, and his body was riddled with machine gun fire. And again, obviously, there's a lot of propaganda at the time. You would say she's biased, but if she was inventing the story for propaganda, she would be likely to say that both brothers had been murdered. But she seems to state the fact that one brother was killed in action and the other brother was taken and summarily executed. And we often tend to think that these kind of war crimes or atrocities don't occur until later in the Civil War. A lot of people say it's after Michael Collins is killed, but you can see there were some of them happening, you know, in early August before that. So to conclude, really, Liam Lynch wrote Ernie O'Malley in August 1922, summing up the situation in Limerick city and county, and he said that the agreement reached at Limerick was broken by the enemy. I believe we will eventually have to destroy all our posts and have to operate as of old in flying colors. And this is what happens. It's a turning point in the Civil War that the IRA no longer holds barracks, they're no longer acting like a regular force, and they have to go back to fighting guerrilla tactics. So I'll just finish on this. I do have a book if anyone is interested on the battle for Limerick City. And John O'Callaghan has a book which I would strongly recommend as well on the battle for Kilmallock if anyone is interested in that. So Shine and Nishaguve Guramila Mahagriv.
Hello, my name is Dr. Brian Hughes and I'm a lecturer in the Department of History at Mary Mackey College here in Limerick. And in this talk I hope to describe and elucidates some minority experiences of Limerick in 1922, specifically those of the enemies, as Republicans saw them, of the recently ended War of Independence. I also hope to complicate a little, at least, some of the more simplistic narratives of the nature of conflict in Ireland during the Civil War, and particularly during 1922. Now, that civil war that broke out in Ireland in 1922 is, very understandably, primarily understood as a conflict between Republicans split over the terms of the Anglo-Irish Treaty, which had been signed in December 1921 and accepted by Dáil Éireann the following month. And this narrative of brother against brother or sister against sister is a powerful one, but it can serve to obscure the conflict as it appeared to some of those who lived through this period. While Republicans fought over the form of independence they were willing to accept, others who had never wanted independence in the first place were forced to make their accommodations with the new order. And among many of the losers of the Irish Revolution were loyalists and unionists who had supported the British administration in Ireland during the War of Independence, either actively or passively, and those who had served in Crown uniforms, either in the armed forces during the Great War or in the Royal Irish Constabulary. For some of these old enemies, the legacies of their allegiances or service were felt during the Civil War as they fell victim to violence and intimidation. And in their own way, these stories form an important part of our understanding of Limerick and indeed Ireland in 1922. The Protestant Unionist minority, many of whom had realised that independence in some form or other was an inevitability long before 1922, this Protestant Unionist minority in the south and in Limerick, they broadly, if somewhat reluctantly, supported the Anglo-Irish Treaty as a means to peace and stability. There was also some comfort to be found in the fact that under the treaty, the Irish Free State was to remain within the British Empire as a dominion. As a split in the Republican movement that would erupt into civil war developed in early 1922, most outside the movement seemed to want to keep their heads down and stay out of trouble. Accepting the new government as something that was beyond their control, Protestants and Unionists in Limerick only seem to have put their heads over the parapet in public to distance themselves from political and military strife. On the 4th of April 1922, for example, Limerick Protestants held a meeting to reaffirm a resolution that was passed in August 1920, in which they declared that they'd never suffered from intolerance of any kind and to denounce ongoing violence against Catholics in Belfast. In Belfast, rioting, burning and expulsions had begun in 1920, aimed at the Catholic population, and they'd continued even after a truce came into effect elsewhere on the island. Sir Charles Barrington, in the chair at the meeting, announced that the question of religion never arose in Limerick or the South. They all, Catholic and Protestant alike, lived in the best of harmony and good fellowship. William Waller, a deputy lieutenant for Limerick, was among the speakers to denounce the violence in Belfast, describing all religious tyranny as abhorrent. On the 24th of March 1922, 5 members of the Catholic McMahon family and a barman who worked for them had been killed in their home in Belfast. Waller described these killings as the worst ever heard of. He also declared that Protestants, a very small minority as he described them, had always been able to carry on in their daily lives without interference. Importantly, the immediate local context for the meeting came in the form of attacks on the Protestant Young Men's Association and on Masonic property in Limerick, violence that was condemned by the Mid-Limerick IRA Brigade and by Limerick Corporation. The late historian Brian P. Murphy suggested that there was no sectarian conflict between Catholics and Protestants in Limerick during the Civil War, though the broad support Protestants in the county and city had offered to the treaty had made their lives more difficult. It marked them out, I guess, in the eyes of anti-treatyites. As John O'Callaghan has astutely pointed out, though, the distinction between political and religious intolerance was a fine one, and it would have meant little to those who were targeted. The Limerick Protestants present at the meeting on the 4th of April may have been speaking genuinely, but doing so at all was to some extent at least motivated by a desire to keep the temperature down, to avoid accusations of condoning what Belfast Catholics defined as a pogrom against them, and thus to prevent any reprisals that might follow. By the end of the month, indeed, 13 Protestants had been killed over 3 nights in the Bandon Valley area of West Cork. Though the motivation for the killings remains indeed hotly contested, there were contemporary suggestions of a link with events in Belfast. The idea that these killings were in some way a reprisal for what was happening to Catholics in the north. Soon after what had happened in the Bandon Valley, Liam Ford, who was officer commanding the Mid-Limerick Brigade of the IRA, published a letter in the press describing threats on the Protestant community in Limerick, which he presumed to be intended as a reprisal for the Belfast atrocities, as cowardly and unjust, and he threatened drastic action against perpetrators. So where it existed, the violence and intimidation against the Unionist and Loyalist minority seems to have been the work of individuals or small groups acting on their own initiative, rather than with any official sanction. Whatever comfort this might have brought to the minority, there was often little that Ford and others could do amidst the chaos of 1922, and Protestant experiences of the Civil War were ultimately personal and localised. In a sermon in Cahernary offering comfort to his flock in the aftermath of the Bandon Valley killings, the new Church of Ireland Bishop of Limerick, Dr. H.V. White, who had recently, he said, ordained one of the victims in Limerick Cathedral, reflected that we scattered, disarmed members of the Church in the south of Ireland have had in the murders of last week a grim reminder of our helplessness. There was no equivalent of the Bandon Valley of any sort in Limerick, but that feeling of helplessness and uncertainty about what was to come was no doubt an important part of the experience of 1922 for Protestants in the city and county, and indeed what they believed might happen is perhaps as important in its own way as what ultimately didn't happen. While religion and politics were closely interwoven, there were also significant numbers of often Catholics serving or former members of the Crown forces in the city and county in 1922. Even if many of those who served in the RIC or British Armed Forces would not have considered themselves to be loyalists or unionists at all, Republican suspicion often fell easily on those with links to the police and military for their assumed loyalty to the British administration. That they had been on the other side in the War of Independence was not easily forgotten. Indeed, for much of the period between the July 1921 truce and the outbreak of civil war in June 1922, the IRA was preparing for a potential resumption of hostilities with the British. In January 1922, IRA battalions in West Limerick were asked to submit information to 1st Southern Division headquarters on all persons guilty of offences against the nation and the army, and of all persons suspected of having assisted the enemy during the same period. In the Newcastle West Battalion area, several men and women, all of whom appear to have been Catholic, were believed to be friendly with Crown forces. In one case, it was assumed that an unemployed man with one leg could not have any other purpose, as it was put, for being in the company of the hated auxiliaries, other than for giving information. A number were accused of association with Thomas Hanley, a veteran of the Great War who served in the Auxiliary Division of the RIC before or up until February 1921, and survived an IRA attempt on his life in Newcastle West in June 1921 before going missing after the truce. Now, around the same time that the IRA were compiling these reports on suspects from the War of Independence period, in January 1922 it was announced that the RIC would be disbanded. This process ultimately took most of the first 8 months of 1922. Men were first transferred to larger centres around the country before being released in a staggered fashion in groups of 30 or 40. As disbanded men gradually filtered out, Ireland was confronted, as it was put, with the problem of the release into civil life of some 13,000 men, many unable to support themselves or their families indefinitely and with few prospects, including about 8,000 Irish-born men and about 1,500 auxiliaries. This was only exacerbated by a general economic depression and what was described as the political situation in Ireland. Chief Secretary of Ireland, Sir Hamer Greenwood, was most apprehensive, he wrote, about the safety of RIC men returning to their homes. He'd been told on the 5th of April by the former police advisor in Ireland, Major Henry Hugh Tudor, that of the 13,000 disbanded men, over 1,300 were considered in special danger. But any man who served in the police force is in danger of murder in Ireland, he wrote. Later that month, RIC Deputy Inspector General C.A. Walsh advised that the vast majority of both officers and men enlisted in Ireland will not be allowed on disbandment to remain in Ireland. They will be compelled to leave the country, and it's anticipated that most of them will remove to Great Britain. Of course, the British recruits who had joined the RIC during the War of Independence, the Black and Tans or the auxiliaries, they were returning home to Britain in a sense, as opposed to Irish-born men who were leaving their home country. The RIC evacuated Limerick City in February 1922 and were sent to Mullingar for disbandment. The auxiliary division quartered in William Street had already departed in January. While the last men disbanded from the force left Dublin Castle and Gormanston Camp in late August. In what the Limerick leader considered scenes unprecedented in the historic annals of the city, the remaining members of the Limerick force evacuated what the paper described as the notorious stronghold at William Street Barracks around 5 p.m. on the 23rd of February, replaced later that evening by a party of East Galway and Clare IRA that had arrived in the city by train. The leader opened its editorial for the 24th of February 1922, and again this is sort of before the outbreak of civil war, but the leader opened its editorial for the 24th of February 1922 by stating that Limerick is today without a solitary RIC man of either the native or imported brand, a reference to the large influx of British recruits into the force beginning in early 1920 and nicknamed the Black and Tans. About 50 of the more recent British recruits had left Limerick earlier in the month, and a week before the events at William Street, police in Adair and Patrickswell had been moved into the city before men then departed city stations in a staggered fashion. So these police in Adair and Patrickswell were brought into the barracks in the city centre. The men in the barracks in the city centre were then finally, the 5 city barracks were then gathered at William Street. Those who were left were gathered at William Street before they finally dispersed and the barracks was handed over to the IRA. For the leader's editor, this was a moment for celebration. The evacuation of the entire force was completed yesterday afternoon, the editorial exclaimed, and it's worth quoting at some length. When scenes of historic interest and the deepest significance were witnessed in connection with the definite changing in our midst of the old order and for the new, the 5 police barracks in the city were completely evacuated by their occupants and handed over to Irish troops, who took over possession amidst every manifestation of popular enthusiasm. From each the tricolour proudly floats, replacing the old-time crown emblems. It's a truly wonderful and inspiring change, and those whose combined efforts and sacrifices brought it about deserve the everlasting gratitude of the nation. The presence of British armed forces in this country has always been the physical, tangible expression of our slavery, and the removal of such forces now is in a real sense the proof of the winning of our liberty. In the last resort, British rule in Ireland always meant armed tyranny, and when that tyranny is finally gone, as it will be shortly under the terms of the treaty, our freedom will, for all practical purposes, be as complete as we may desire to make it. This theme was then repeated in the paper's report of the evacuation. William Street Barracks was described as the headquarters of the RIC during the Reign of Terror. Readers were told that what had been in the realms of dreams a few months earlier had finally become actual fact. And the people of Limerick were said to have wanted to be in at the kill, as large feverish crowds gathered at William Street and greeted the departing RIC with the occasional ironical outburst of cheering. Importantly, this was also an opportunity taken by the leader to reiterate its support for the treaty and the freedoms it granted, all the essentials of liberty, as the editorial put it, and part of this was symbolised in replacing the old RIC with Irish troops. And as Sean William Gagnon's research has demonstrated, Limerick seems to have been a particularly inhospitable place for many disbanded policemen in 1922. Gagnon has found that among 163 Irishmen disbanded from the force in Limerick, only 23 remained in the county in January 1923, while over 70% were collecting pensions at addresses in Britain. And so thus over the course of 1923, or 1922 I should say, these men had actually left Ireland. At the same time as the force in the city was being disbanded, Limerick County Council amended its university scholarship scheme for 1922, and the children of ex-RIC were specifically excluded from eligibility. When it was noted that the wording debarred the children of all former RIC, including those who had resigned and those who went on to join the IRA, the Scholarship Committee declined to make any changes. The new scheme was passed by the Council on the 25th of February 1922, seemingly without comment. The record of a policeman during the conflict could, however, determine his treatment after disbandment. When Dennis Harrington and Florence Donnelly, who'd been stationed in Patrickswell, moved into the Kerry No. 2 Brigade area in May 1922, inquiries were made about their record. And so where they were moving was also potentially important. But the Director of Intelligence reported that Harrington was one of the old peelers who were sticking on. Patrickswell was a very quiet area, and it's quite possible that he might not be so quiet if the area were more vigorous. I would, however, recommend that he be allowed reside in Ireland. The same recommendation was applied to Donnelly. Between 1926 and 1930, Southern Irish Loyalists could apply for compensation from the British Treasury-funded Irish Grants Committee for losses endured on account of their loyalty to the British administration between July 1921 and May 1923. While they must be used with caution, the application files provide important detail on the experiences of self-proclaimed loyalists in 1922. The claims from Limerick highlight the nature of low-level threat and harm experienced by some loyalists in the city and county, ranging from threats and damaged property to arson, forced expulsion and shooting, perpetrated by National Army troops or Free State Army troops, anti-treaty IRA, and indeed by others. Complaints of boycotting and forced levies or billeting of men, often by anti-treatyites pejoratively described as irregulars, were also common. A large proportion of 151 claims to the scheme with Limerick connections were from Catholics. These included ex-RIC, who claimed that they had been visited by raiders and left Limerick either temporarily or permanently following threats of violence. And it does seem that a lot of these threats came directly from the anti-treaty IRA, because the forms or the letters, the threatening letters, were signed by anti-treaty officers. Also among the applicants were a number of ex-servicemen whose land was occupied by Republicans or others for periods during the Civil War. During the War of Independence, the IRA had shot at least 4 ex-servicemen as alleged spies, and others claimed to have been forcibly removed from their land. 7 ex-servicemen who had been granted land at Bottomstown in Knocklong in 1921 under a government land settlement scheme for ex-servicemen, for instance, complained that they'd been forcibly removed. All were deprived of their land throughout 1922 and into May 1923, when it was seized by the Free State Army and returned. Among them was Edmund Davern, who was a veteran of the Australian Army, in fact, and who became postmaster at Elton when he returned to Ireland in 1919. A number of the Protestant applicants to the Irish Grants Committee were retired British Army officers like Major Charles Langford, who complained of regular petty violence and harassment. And this suggests that among Unionists and Loyalists in Limerick, it was those with links to past service to the Crown who were particularly likely to be targeted during the Civil War. Major Langford also sought compensation for, as he put it, having to send my wife out of the country and keeping my son in England. Over 30 other Limerick Irish Grants Committee applicants, a mix of Catholic and Protestant, had an address outside the Irish Free State in the later 1920s when they submitted their applications. At the July 1922 Limerick Diocesan Synod, Bishop White of the Church of Ireland referred to the loss of many of the Free State's best, most patriotic and progressive citizens, forced from their native land by political or religious intolerance. In 1923, he lamented the hundreds of industrious Protestant Irish men and women who had left because they felt that they were not welcome here, and that satisfactory careers could not be secured for their boys and girls in their own country. Now, if this hinted at some sectarian undertones, or if it might seem like White is suggesting sectarian motivations here, he did also add that anything like a Protestant exodus would be deplored by our present rulers. And in spite of the turbulence and uncertainty of 1922, there remained space for the losers of the War of Independence to express their old allegiances, even if only in a low-key or private way. The Protestant Young Men's Association, whose property had been targeted with violence, felt assured enough to end its meetings with a rendition of God Save the King. And large numbers of ex-policemen, ex-servicemen and loyalists continued to live and work in Limerick City and County beyond 1922. All of the ex-servicemen who claimed compensation in the late 1920s for being deprived of their land at Bottomstown had remained in the area. Edmund Davern continued as postmaster in Knocklong. A memorial was unveiled in St Mary's Church of Ireland Cathedral in February 1922 to men of Thomond who fell in the war 1914 to 1918, made of Limerick limestone, executed by Messrs T. O'Doherty and Sons of Limerick, with a bronze plaque listing 44 names. A large congregation attended the ceremony, and there was standing room only for some. The Bishop of Limerick told attendees that the memorial there would the Bishop of Limerick told attendees that there had been few services in the history of the cathedral that were of more interest, and the memorial would become a place of pilgrimage in days to come, and people would be proud to find in the list the names of relatives. It was not only a token of love and reverence, it was a symbol of wonderful victory, he said. People were apt to forget how great that victory was. Though, as Tádraig Maloney has pointed out, Catholic ex-servicemen were precluded from visiting this memorial, and it wasn't until 1924 when they could hold their own service of remembrance. As 37 members of the RIC had left Limerick City on the morning of the 22nd of February for Mullingar, they were met at the station by a number of friends as the band of the Oxford and Buckingham Light Infantry played a selection of tunes. So those ironical cheers described by the Limerick leader were not the full story of the response to the departing RIC, even if perhaps they represented more people than the friends who showed up to greet this particular group of departing men. Many of the disbanded RIC who left Ireland in 1922 also felt safe enough to return after the end of the Civil War in 1923. The experiences of those who came out on the wrong side of history at the end of the Irish War of Independence were thus varied and often individual. In Limerick in 1922, there appears to have been a particular desire to, at its most benign, keep an eye on former servants of the Crown Forces, and at its worst, to drive them from the city or county. It's these latter extremes that are often the best documented, though not always the most representative, and it's worth our while to embrace the particular messiness and complexity of this period. Thanks very much for your time and for listening.
Well, hello everyone. My name is Dr. Stephen Griffin, and I'm here today to talk a little bit about the Royal Munster Fusiliers, a British Army regiment with many close ties and connections to Limerick City, and it is additionally fitting to discuss the Fusiliers in this symposium, as 2022 also marks the centenary of the regiment's disbandment in 1922. Now, to start off really is just to give you some background on the British Army in Ireland. Now, English armies had been in Ireland throughout the early modern era. During the Tudor period, the English army often numbered somewhere between 1,200 to 2,500 men, often dependent on mercenaries and local land magnates for recruits. When in conflict with the Irish nobility, the army could balloon to over 20,000. And by the 1660s, you see a new army has been established during the reign of King Charles II, and that army was regimented by 1683. Now, Irish enlistment in the British Army gradually increases during the 18th century. You had penal restrictions which had blocked Catholics from serving in the British Army, but these were removed in the 1770s, and Catholic Irishmen were enlisting in both the regular army and the armies of the East India Company. We'll talk a bit more about them in a moment, and that's by the end of the century. By the 1830s and 1840s, the Irish had come to make up roughly 40% of the British Army. You've got about 42,897 Irishmen in the British Army in 1830. And this would decrease very slightly 10 years later, when there was about 41,000 Irish recruits. Now, Irish soldiers were looked on as disciplined and organised, and they served throughout Britain and the Empire. And you also have soldiers being stationed in Ireland throughout the 19th century. And the numbers of British soldiers in Ireland, the ones who were garrisoned here, eventually grows to roughly 25,000 men. Now, back in the 18th century, soldiers who were on garrison duty in Ireland, if they ever experienced indigestion or bowel discomfort, to put it mildly, they would refer to having or to be experiencing what they call the case of the Limericks. Now, statements like those really reflect how the army viewed being garrisoned in Limerick, not particularly highly. Yet at the same time, Limerick was the third city of Ireland, a very strategic, important site on the Shannon. And it's a major garrison for the British Army. You have 4 barracks located in the city or in the area. And the first and the oldest of these was the Castle Barracks, what is now King John's Castle. And that was constructed in the 1740s. During the French Revolutionary period and the Napoleonic Wars, 2 more barracks were constructed. This was the new barracks, what many would know today as Sarsfield Barracks. That was completed in the 1790s. And then in 1807, what was known as the Ordnance Barracks was built on modern-day Mulgrave Street. And eventually, the Strand Barracks came into being in 1841. That is, I'm sure many of you will know, located on what is now Clancy Strand. And that was formerly a house of industry, which was intended to essentially provide relief to the poor of the area. Now, if we go back to the Munster Fusiliers, their origins really lie in the armies of the East India Company, whom I alluded to earlier. And the East India Company was a trading company that were chartered in 1600, and they are essentially at the forefront of British expansion in Asia. They're focused in India, where they form 3 presidencies: the Presidency of Bombay, the Presidency of Calcutta, and the Presidency of Madras. Now, each presidency possessed its own private army, and these are formed to defend the company's commercial and political foothold in India. Now, as laws in Britain and Ireland relax against Catholics serving in the army, you see a sizable increase in Irish Catholic enlistment in the company's armies. And by 1813, the company had 4 recruiting offices in Ireland, and Irishmen account for roughly half of all East India Company recruits in the first half of the 19th century. Now, in 1857, you get Indian soldiers in the Bengal Army basically rise up against their European officers. And this was, it was known as the Indian Mutiny. Many would refer to it as India's first war of independence nowadays. But when this was put down, this revolt was put down in 1858, the government of India is transferred from the East India Company to the Crown. And the soldiers, the company soldiers, are then incorporated into the British Army. Therefore, you have the company's old regiment called the Royal Bengal Fusiliers become the 101st Regiment of Foot. and another regiment, confusingly called the Bengal Fusiliers, become the 104th Regiment of Foot. Now, by 1881, the infantry of the British Army is organised into territorial regiments, and recruitment for these takes place in specified regions in England, Scotland, Ireland, and Wales. Now, the 101st and 104th regiments are amalgamated into the Royal Munster Fusiliers, and those two old regiments become the first two battalions of the Munster Fusiliers. In addition to that, the South Cork Militia, the Kerry Militia, and the Limerick County Militia become the 3rd, 4th, and 5th respective battalions of the Munster Fusiliers as well. And recruits are essentially drawn from Clare, Cork, Limerick, Kerry, and Tipperary. And the regiment's headquarters is in Ballymullen Barracks in Tralee. Now, joining the army at this time, it provides men with economic security. You know, they're being paid, they're being fed, clothed, housed, they're getting medical attention if they need it. And on top of that, in the 1880s, an army private can expect to earn about £40 a year. His counterpart in Ireland, who does not enlist and just works as your average everyday labourer, could expect £25 a year by comparison. Now, the army preferred to draw recruits from rural Ireland, where men have agricultural backgrounds, so they have experience of hard physical labour, and they were viewed to be much fitter and capable of carrying out some of the more taxing military duties like digging trenches. But I mean, as the population of Ireland had declined in the 1840s due to famine and immigration, many soldiers, the army begins to recruit men from urban areas. Now, the army also ensures that local industry, wherever the army is garrisoned, that means local industry will experience an increase in trade. To take Limerick as an example, you have about 1,000 soldiers garrisoned in the 4 barracks. They all require provisions, they require equipment. You need food for the men, you need food for the animals as well. And I mean, to give an example, the Limerick clothing factory supplied thousands of uniforms to the army. And that factory, by the end of the turn of the 19th century or 20th century, they were one of the city's largest employers. Now, a soldier's day-to-day activities, really, it's mostly military drills and exercises in the morning. And playing sports was a common pastime in the afternoon. And there are numerous references to sports teams in the ranks of the Royal Munster Fusiliers. The British Army is often linked to Limerick rugby, and there are connections between the army and rugby. But the military didn't introduce the sport to the city. That honour goes to the cities and counties, upper and middle classes, who learned the game when studying in the public schools of England, and then brought it back with them when they returned home. But there are also close links between the military and the city's brass bands. The Boherbue band, the St Mary's fife and drum. Those were modelled on the bands that the army had, and many members of those bands also served as musicians in the army. Now, there's a very famous incident involving the Royal Munster Fusiliers in 1893. You had a number of drunken soldiers who were on leave from Cork. They refused to show their tickets for inspection when they were getting the train to Dublin. And then they beat up and threatened the train guards when the guards were called. By the time the train got to Limerick Junction, you then had Munsters, as they were called, from Limerick, who then boarded, and all of these Cork and Limerick members of the Munster Fusiliers then go up to the first class carriages and destroy them and just leave a horrible mess. And then they move back along the train, causing all sorts of destruction. And the train eventually has to be stopped at Inchicore, where the military authorities detain them. And there's reports of soldiers trying to hide under the seats, trying not to be caught, not to be found. But despite incidents like those, in general, Irish soldiers were never noted for indiscipline. Charges that would be brought against soldiers are often quite minor, maybe perhaps drunkenness or neglect of duty. Now, the Munster Fusiliers, their nickname was the Dirty Shirts, and it's suggested that that name stems from their service in India, when they had discarded their tunics to fight in shirt sleeves in the heat of India in the 1850s. When they weren't in Ireland or Britain, the 1st and 2nd Battalions were often stationed in various corners of the British Empire. In the late 19th, early 20th centuries, the 1st Battalion of the Munsters served in Canada, South Africa, India and Burma. The 2nd Battalion was in Malta, India, Burma, South Africa, and also Gibraltar. Now, I mentioned South Africa. The Second Boer War began in October 1899, and this essentially comes about as the British Empire expands in southern Africa, seeking to gain control of the Transvaal Republic and the Orange Free State, which were inhabited by Dutch-speaking settlers, known more commonly as the Boers. Now, from the onset, the war did not go according to plan for the British. The Boers were well armed, they were resourceful, they knew the terrain. And as a result, the British experienced a number of defeats in battles such as Colenso and Spion Kop. However, the British soon managed to gain the upper hand and were able to take control of the Boer republics by September 1900. The Boers then began a guerrilla war, and in response, the British initiated a scorched earth policy and destroyed Boer farms, and the families of Boer militiamen were sent to concentration camps. Overall, it's estimated about 22,000 British soldiers, 34,000 Boer combatants and civilians, at least 14,000 indigenous Africans died. And the war proved to be Britain's most expensive conflict in about 100 years. Despite all of this, despite the efforts of Irish nationalists, I should say, to stop enlistment in the British Army, evidence shows that recruitment carried on as normal, even increased. And of course, the Munster Fusiliers were involved in all of this, and involved in those battles and fighting Boer guerrillas. But there's a wonderful account from 1900 when the 5th Battalion of the Munsters departed Strand Barracks on their way to South Africa. And the newspapers, the eyewitnesses in the newspapers described this departure. The quotation is, "It's heartbreaking and at times comical," because the soldiers are described as straggling forward in knots of 2s and 3s on their way to the train station, surrounded by this crowd of women and children. And the account describes wives carrying military equipment while the men quickly skive off and break ranks to get into the pub to have a quick drink. There are accounts that some of the men were drunk, they had to be carried to the station, and eventually the train manages to depart. I mean, the quotation is, the train departed amid the frantic waving of hands and handkerchiefs, the farewell shouts of the men and awful cries of the women left behind. Now, if we jump ahead a few more years, war is eventually declared between Britain and Germany on 4th August 1914. And the First World War initially began, of course, in the Balkans, quickly escalates into a conflict between the Entente powers, Britain, France, Italy, Russia until 1917, and from 1917 the USA. And on the other side, you have the Central Powers, Germany, Austria, Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire from 1915. Now, this is really, you have all these belligerent states, they control global empires. So this ensured that their overseas territories would also experience warfare. You've got the trenches of Europe, there's fighting in Africa, in the Middle East, some hostilities in Asia also. So this, the First World War really was a conflict between industrialized societies, states mobilizing mass armies of men, while millions of women are employed in wartime industries, governments using visual propaganda to maintain war support. On the front, you've got men engaged in trench warfare. Industrial production, technological developments have all seen the eventual utilization of, mustard gas, submachine guns, aircraft and tanks. And in total, you've got about 206,000 Irishmen in the British Army, or in the British forces more generally, during the First World War. And there's an unknown number of how many were serving before 1914, but at least 4,000 Limerick men did join up between 1914 to 18. And the highest day for enlistment in the Royal Munster Fusiliers was 29th April 1915, which saw 74 men recruited in Limerick City. On top of that, Limerick had the highest rate of recruitment per head of population in the Munster area. And because of an increase in recruitment, 4 new battalions were added to the Munsters during the course of the war, the 6th, 7th, 8th and 9th battalions. Now 93% of Limerick recruits joined up, enlisted in the city. And we actually have the percentage of enlistments from each of Limerick's 4 parishes, St. John's, St. Michael's, St. Mary's, St. Munchin's. About 36.4% of enlistments came from St. John's Parish. 32.8% came from St. Michael's. 13.8% came from St. Mary's, and 6.7% were from St. Munchin's. I mean, to give an example, there was one family from Upper Henry Street, the McKnights, and they had 7 sons, and every one of them joined the army. And of those 7 sons, 6 of them served in the Munster Fusiliers. One of the brothers was killed at Gallipoli. 3 others were wounded on the Western Front. And the 7th brother, who was actually with the Leinster Regiment, was also wounded. Now, the Munsters saw action at many of the most well-known battles of the Western Front. They also fought in Gallipoli as well, in what is now modern-day Turkey. But they were present at Mons, Givenchy, Aubert, Luce, the Somme, Messines, Passchendaele, the Kaiserschlacht, and what's known as the 100 Days Offensive. The 2nd Battalion of the Munsters spent the duration of the war on the Western Front, and they went into battle at full strength on 13 occasions. And in 10 of those instances, the battalion returned with less than 6 officers and less than 300 men. Now, eventually, the armistice was signed between the Allies and Germany on 11th November 1918, and at least 37,000 Irishmen have been killed in the conflict. About 1,000 of those came from Limerick. 300 of those were killed with the Munsters. Limerick's youngest casualty was Lance Corporal John Nash, the 2nd Battalion of the Munsters, and he was killed in February 1916 at age 16. Overall, the Munster Fusiliers lost at least 2,578 men over the course of the war, and many thousands more were injured. Now, after the war, the 2nd Battalion is sent to Egypt, where it basically serves almost as kind of a police force. They have kind of a police duty, putting down civil unrest in 1920s Cairo. Now, apart really during that time, kind of the early 1920s, apart from the Connacht Rangers, Irish regiments largely remained quiet during the War of Independence in Ireland. Ex-soldiers did join the Irish Republican Army, others fell victim to both the IRA and the Crown forces, as both struggled for control of the country. But despite what was happening in Ireland, the British Army continued to have appeal for Irish men, and it's estimated another 20,000 men enlisted during this period in time. Now, throughout 1921 to early 1922, there were rumours, and it was eventually confirmed, that the Royal Munster Fusiliers were to be disbanded, along with 6 other Irish regiments. And on 11th June at 4:45 p.m, the Munsters are paraded with the regimental colours for the last time. And the next day, on 12th June 1922, the colours were handed over to George V, King George V, at a ceremony at Windsor Castle. And on 17th of June 1922, the regiment has its very last regimental dinner. And then throughout June and July, the men were discharged from service, and they assimilated quite easily into Irish society post-1922. Many of them enlisted in the Free State Army, and it wasn't uncommon for ex-members of the Munsters to re-enlist to fight in the Second World War between 1939 to 1945. There was also houses, you can find houses for ex-servicemen from the Munsters. They're in Kilmallock. If you look in the city, you'll find them in areas like Rossbrine and Bengal Terrace. At the same time, other ex-servicemen did live in rather reduced circumstances. They weren't as well off. The memory of the regiment was kept alive by what was called the Old Comrades Association. And this was first formed in 1914. And this association, they would organise an annual dinner, memorial services in Limerick, Cork, Tralee and London. And they also would provide financial aid for former members of the regiment. And that association's heyday really was in the late 1920s and 1930s. Membership then began to decline in the 1950s and 1960s. And eventually the association was disbanded in 1969. But the memory of the Royal Munster Fusiliers continues to live on in the Royal Munster Fusiliers Association. And with that, I think we are finished. I hope you enjoyed this talk, and take care.
On the 7th of January 1922, the Anglo-Irish Treaty was approved by the Second Dáil by a close vote of 64 to 57. Less than a month later, on the 5th of February, a convention was held by Cumann to discuss this. A tally was taken, and 419 Cumann members voted against the treaty, as opposed to 63 in favour of the treaty. Cumann, or the Irish Women's Council, was founded in Wynn's Hotel in Dublin in April 1914 as a female auxiliary to the Irish Volunteers. Its primary aim was to advance the cause of Irish liberation through arming and equipping Irish men for the defence of Ireland. By 1918, there were 600 branches of Cumann throughout the country. The involvement of Irish women in the revolutionary period was essential to the logistics operations of the campaign. Although women often went unnoticed, this would play to their advantage, as they were couriers of messages and weapons. There were 4 main branches of Cumann in Limerick, each of these associated with a branch of the Irish Volunteers. These were the Limerick City branch, and this was an independent, the Mid Limerick Brigade, the East Limerick Brigade, and the West Limerick Brigade. The Limerick City branch covered the same area as the Mid-Limerick Brigade, but unlike the Mid-Limerick Brigade, who received orders from the District Council, the Limerick City branch received direct orders from head office in Dublin. In August 1922, several months into the Civil War, Commemorative saw their first fatality. The victim, a Mrs. Margaret Hartney, was from Limerick City, but a member of the Mid-Limerick Brigade, who was posted in County Limerick at the time. Although Commemorative played a primary supportive role during the Irish Civil War, their role was not without its dangers, as they were often near the front lines or were the targets of personal attacks. Margaret Hartney, who is sometimes recorded as Hartnett or Hartigan, was an educated woman. She was still attending school at the age of 15, which is quite unusual at the time. She was born Margaret Glynn on the 9th of August 1885 in 22 Upper Cornwallis Street, which is now Gerald Griffin Street in Limerick City. Her parents were Margaret McMahon and William Glynn, a photographer from Castle Island, but living in the city. By 1901, she was living at 37 Upper William Street with her brother William, who was 5 years older than her. He was employed as a compositor at the time, and it's through this connection that she likely met her future husband. On the 17th of February, 1909, she was living at 14 Windmill Street. While there, she married Michael Hartney of 17 Denmark Street. He worked as a printer's compositor with the Limerick Leader at the time. They married in St. Joseph's Church on O'Connell Avenue. As mentioned, as her brother was in the printing business, he and her future husband may have been acquainted. She recorded her father's occupation as an upholsterer at the time of her marriage, but I haven't found any further record of him apart from her birth certificate to show whether he stopped his job as a photographer or an error was made on Margaret's marriage certificate. She didn't note if he was deceased on her marriage certificate, but this wasn't always common. In the 1911 census, she was recorded as speaking both Irish and English fluently, a trait common among nationalists in Limerick at the time. Her first child, Maury or Maura Hartney, was born on the 24th of February 1910 at their home in 9 Island View Terrace in Kings Island. Their second daughter, Margaret Catherine Hartney, was born just over a year later, the 5th of September 1911, at 4 St. Munchin's Terrace. It was not unusual for people to move house often during this time period. People often went through several houses even in the same year. As mentioned, she was a member of the Mid-Limerick Brigade of Commemorative during the Irish War of Independence, and later joined the anti-treaty side of the Irish Civil War. Her husband was her counterpart as a member of the Mid-Limerick Brigade of the Irish Republican Army. He was born in 1887, the son of a pig buyer and 2 years younger than Margaret. He joined the Irish Volunteers in 1914. He was in active service throughout the period of revolution as a member of the Mid-Limerick Brigade under the command of Michael Colvett, Pádraig, and later Liam Ford. In 1920, he was imprisoned several times in small jails, as well as in the new barracks in Limerick, in Cork Prison, in Spike Island, in Wormwood Scrubs in England, in Brixton Prison in England, and finally he was released in July 1920. Throughout the revolutionary period, the house was a meeting place for Irish volunteers in the Mid-Limerick Brigade. This put the house on a watch list, which led to it being attacked several times and blown up in 1920. Although Michael was often on the run, the house was still seen as a safe haven, and Margaret would have been privy to decisions being made by the brigade in her home. On the 4th of August 1922, Margaret and her husband were on active duty in the area in and around Adare in County Limerick. A rainstorm that day lowered visibility. Margaret was working in the anti-treaty headquarters in Dunraven Arms Hotel as part of the Limerick Division of Commemorative in the 1st Aid Unit under the command of a Mrs. Spillane. At the time, her husband was fighting 4 kilometres away at Hickey's Cross, Adare, where he received a gunshot wound to the right arm. He was then transported to the Dunraven Arms Hotel to be tended by those there, including his wife. While Margaret was tending the wounds, including her husband's, the Free Army shelled the hotel, firing a 16 or 18-pound artillery shell at the building. The next day, the following bulletin was issued by the publicity department in the publicity department of the Field General's Headquarters, Southwest Command. They stated, Adare was captured about 7 p.m. on Friday. West Limerick troops under Brigadier Keane and a detachment of troops under Colonel Commandant Keogh converged on the village simultaneously from 2 different points. The irregulars apparently hastily retired after a few shells had been fired on their headquarters, the Dunraven Arms Hotel. When the national troops relieved the hotel, all rooms in the building were found besplattered with blood, showing there must have been severe casualties amongst the irregulars. Mr. Michael Hartnett, a Limerick leader of the irregulars, and his wife, who was staying in the hotel, were both killed. The troops had 1 killed and 1 or 2 wounded. Despite how the scene appeared and how it was reported in the paper, there was only 1 fatality amongst the irregulars, amongst the anti-treaty side, and that was Margaret. She was killed instantly when the shell struck. It was the following day before Michael was informed of the death of his wife, as he was being treated for his wound in Rathkeale. The Freeman Journal of the 7th of August 1922 gives a clearer picture of the events of that day. They go on to say, and I quote, "The operations which resulted in the rout of the irregulars in Adare were commenced at 5 o'clock on Friday morning in a rainstorm. Wires our special correspondent. All through the day, troops pressed forward and had to fight their way through a network of outposts and barricades. The irregulars' headquarters, the Dunraven Hotel, was shelled on, and one of the shells landed near a veranda and killed Mrs. Hartney, the wife of an irregular leader, who was also seriously injured. The capture of Adare considerably relieved the national position and brings about the establishment of a 25-mile front along the Kilmallock line. The remains of Mrs. Hartney were brought to Limerick last night, and the cortege was of a large dimension." Michael Hartney returned home to Limerick City with his wife's remains and was laid up due to his wounds for 5 months, but he attended the funeral. He stated in his official records that he was attended by Sister Aquitaine of St. John's Hospital, who he described as a great friend of the IRA, although he never attended the hospital himself. Limerick came out in force for the funeral of Margaret Hartney. Her remains were interred in the Republican plot of Mount St. Lawrence Cemetery 3 days after her death. Her injured husband and 2 young daughters were mourning at the graveside. The Limerick Chronicle of the 8th of August 1922 mentions that The remains of the late Mrs. M. Hartney, whose death occurred under tragic circumstances at Adair on Friday evening, were interred yesterday morning in Mount St. Lawrence Cemetery. On Sunday evening at 8:30, the remains reached the city from Newcastle West by a circuitous route and were taken to St. Michael's Catholic Church, where they rested overnight. Yesterday morning at 10 o'clock, Requiem Mass was sung for the repose of the soul of the deceased, the celebrants being Reverend Father Carroll. At the close of the Mass, the funeral left for the cemetery. The cortege was large and representative proportions and expressed the sympathy felt for the husband and family of the deceased in the sorrow. The chief mourners were Mr. M. Hartnett, husband, the two daughters of the deceased, Mrs. M. Murphy, sister, Mrs. J. Fintonen, aunt, Mr. J. Fintonen, Mr. M. Mulqueen, uncle, Mrs. J. Ryan and J. J. Ryan, M. Ryan, E. Ryan, W. Finnerty, T. Andrew, and M. Murphy, all relatives. The clergy present were Father Duane, the administrator in St. Michael's Church, Reverend Father Carroll, Reverend Father Hannon, Reverend Father Fitzpatrick, Reverend Father Ferdinand, Reverend Father Hennessy, and Reverend Father Carroll officiated at the grave. She was posthumously awarded the Service Medal for 1917 to 1921 with bar from the Irish military for her actions during the revolutionary period. After Margaret's death and Michael's injury, he had to leave active duty to take care of his children, who were at risk of being removed from his custody to the workhouse. Michael went on to receive a pension for his role during this period and a wound gratuity of £20 in 1941 for the effects of the bullet wound on the day Margaret was killed. He remarried in St. Michael's Church on the 29th of July 1925 to a Mary McMahon, a spinster living on Wolfton Street. They had no further children. Michael returned to his work as a compositor. On the 25th of June 1945, he was elected as Mayor of Limerick, and he held the role for a year. He died on the 26th of July 1964, outliving his first wife by almost 42 years. Margaret's eldest daughter, Maura, became a nun, Sister Mary Gerald, and she travelled from Ireland to New Mexico, to Utah, finally to Washington, D.C. Her younger daughter, Margaret, married a Mr. Forster and relocated to Zimbabwe, where she died in 1984. The death of Margaret Hartnett had an impact on the civil war in Limerick, but she was not alone. There were many other women killed and injured during the conflict. The majority of those injured were probably unreported, so we will never be able to gather the real number. Often those who were killed were caught in the crossfire, including those who were killed during the Battle of Limerick in July 1922. There was 18-year-old Mary Caddy of New Road who died of a chest wound, 19-year-old Bridget O'Brien of Bank Place who died of multiple bullet wounds, and 54-year-old Ellen Windrum who died from a wound to her body. Windrum was the widowed mother of teenage children. Later in the year, the young Catherine Mary Hogan, who was only 13 years old, when she died from a head wound she received during crossfire in Glynn in October 1922. The death of men was almost expected, but for a woman to be killed, especially the mother of young children and teenage girls, would have rocked the sensibilities of the community.
I'm Dr. John O'Callaghan. I work in Atlantic Technological University, Sligo, and I'm going to talk now about the Battle for Kilmallock, which was one of the most important battles in the Irish Civil War. For 2 weeks in the summer of 1922, in late July, early August 1922, the town of Kilmallock and its outskirts, its hinterland, became a crucial Civil War battleground, with the pro-treaty National Army and the anti-treaty Irish Republican Army, IRA, clashing around the Cork-Limerick border. So we'll look at why Kilmallock and this part of Limerick became the location for this important battle. We'll look at the course of the battle itself, and I'll discuss some of the decisive factors in its outcome. So the map you see on the screen now is courtesy of the Atlas of the Irish Revolution from UCC and RTE also. It gives us a sense of the big picture at the time of the Battle for Kilmallock. So you'll note a yellow line running across the top of the province of Munster, and the heartland of anti-treaty IRA resistance to the National Army during the Civil War was the so-called Munster Republic of Cork and Kerry. And Liam Lynch, who was the anti-treaty IRA Chief of Staff, he established a very patchy defensive line, really an illusory defensive line, I suppose, protecting the Munster Republic. So it ran from Limerick City in the west, flanked on the north by the River Shannon, across the towns of Tipperary, down to Waterford City in the southeast, flanked by the River Suir. But both Limerick and Waterford, having been occupied by Republicans, both cities fell to the National Army on the 21st of July, and at the same time and shortly thereafter, anti-treatyites were being dislodged all across Tipperary. So Liam Lynch's line, it vanished. Now, to be fair to Lynch, he never used the term Munster Republic. That's a construct that historians have imposed on this since. You'll note the map details also the seaborne landings that happened around this time. So the National Army successfully shipped troops from Dublin and landed them in Kerry. You'll see near Tralee on the 2nd of August, and along the coast of Cork some days later at various points, around a week or so after the Tralee landings. And those successful landings proved crucial in the Battle for Kilmallock, and we'll look at why that was the case. Now, to focus in on Limerick. So once they were in firm control of Limerick City, the National Army used it as a base, and it was an ideal base from which to consolidate and then to extend influence around the whole county. So after losing the battle for Limerick City, the anti-treaty IRA retreated south. Kilmallock then, well, Kilmallock, you might know, South Limerick market town, and the town itself and its hinterland, as I said, became the location of a very large-scale and lengthy military engagement. So why Kilmallock? Well, it was the first big town between Limerick City and the Cork border, and along with Bruff and Brewery that you'll see on the map, it formed a rough triangle. And you have the Charleville also then, a major town in North Cork, just a few miles south of Brewery and Kilmallock, and that raises the stakes. So at first glance, you know, Kilmallock might be a fairly unlikely location for this battle. There's no specific prize on offer, no particular strategic or economic target maybe. The real target here is physical control of territory, dominance of territory. At this point in the Civil War, there's a race on to control territory, and that's what's happening here. The anti-treaty IRA so makes a determined stand in this Bruff, Brewery, Kilmallock triangle because it presented a very strong barrier to any National Army advance from Limerick City on Cork. It had also served to threaten the flank of a National Army advance westwards from Limerick City to the Kerry border. We have to consider the geography of Kilmallock itself also, and that geography lent itself to a stubborn defence. So there are a series of small hills that surround Kilmallock and that dominate approaches to the town. And the town itself sits in a hollow on the banks of the River Luba. So if anti-treaty forces, if the IRA could hold on to these heights, Ash Hill, Quarry Hill, Kilmallock Hill, Knoxuna Hill, if they could maintain a hold there, dislodging them from Kilmallock, driving them out of Kilmallock would be extremely challenging. You see there National Army troops firing an 18-pound field gun during the fighting in County Limerick at some point in July 22. Now, artillery proves crucial in this opening phase of the Civil War, in the 6 weeks or so between the outbreak of fighting in Dublin at the end of June and the middle of August 1922. Artillery is absolutely crucial. Most of the fighting early on happened around barracks, in cities and towns and villages, and because they were the site of barracks, they were the most likely sources of food and shelter. So troops concentrated there. They were a way to hold territory. This is where the fights happened. So the National Army, because of this, was able to capitalise on its superiority in heavy equipment, and was able to range its artillery against the fixed positions that were occupied by the enemy. So the IRA, the anti-treaty side, was proficient in the hit-and-run ambush tactics of guerrilla warfare. It was a guerrilla army. It had no artillery of its own. It had no effective countermeasures to deploy against the artillery of the National Army, and this decided the Battle of Limerick City. It decided the fighting in Waterford, and it's crucial to a certain extent as well around County Limerick. The command structures then of the opposing forces, who was in charge and how did they measure up against each other? Well, Liam Deasy, you'll see him in the top left as we look at this slide. Liam Deasy was the officer commanding of the 1st Southern Division of the IRA. His colleague in charge of the anti-treatyites around Kilmallock was Sean Moylan. Moylan was officer commanding of the North Cork Brigade, and Moylan was native to this area. They led the anti-treaty IRA during the battle for Kilmallock. So they pitted their wits, they pitted their resources against a former comrade, General Lone O'Duffy. So you'll see O'Duffy in the bottom right there, and that photo is probably taken in Cruise's hotel in Limerick City. O'Duffy, second in command, Major General W.R.E. Murphy was his name. He was a highly decorated former British officer. So this partnership of O'Duffy and Murphy as his adjutant, it really provided an ideal combination of IRA guerrilla experience with conventional military force command experience. At the start of the battle for Kilmallock, the anti-treaty IRA actually outnumbered the National Army. It had probably 1,500 or so well-armed fighters within just a few miles of the Limerick-Cork border, so around Kilmallock, Bruff, Bruree, down to Charleville at the end of July. Many of these 1,500 were among the most proven campaigners from the War of Independence, so they were experienced fighters. However, they had just lost Limerick City, so their morale was low. Their sense of purpose was probably undermined a bit further by inter-county friction, so the Limerick and Cork men and the Kerry contingent, they didn't always all get on. They wouldn't always take orders from each other's officers. On the National Army side, Murphy had about 2,000 troops at his disposal by the start of August. Now, a lot of them were raw, they'd been hastily recruited and trained, and they proved unreliable when it came to the fighting, when it came to the action. And O'Duffy was particularly scathing in his assessment of a lot of his recruits. He called them semi-disciplined, he called some of them undesirable. Both sides found it hard to provide for their troops. Provisions were scarce all around. Deasy admitted he actually had to demobilise some men who he couldn't actually feed. O'Duffy talked about his forces having to scrounge on the countryside. So maybe it's not surprising, but desertion and transfer of allegiance actually as well were not uncommon on either side. So you had men deserting their posts, you had IRA men going over to the National Army and vice versa in some situations. And coordinated action on any large scale proved generally beyond the capabilities of the anti-treatyites. When it came to the final advance on Kilmallock, the National Army coordinated their movements very well. Some of you will be familiar with that building. It is the former RIC barracks in Bluff, which was occupied by both sides during late July 1922, held at various points by anti-treatyites, then by the National Army, eventually held and secured and maintained by the National Army in the last days of July. There's Ashfield Towers in Kilmallock. Ashfield Towers was occupied during the fighting, during the battle for Kilmallock, by anti-treaty IRA troops, and one of those troops was Frank O'Connor, later celebrated novelist, writer. And O'Connor described his time, or some of his time, in Ashfield Towers, and what he wrote was this: "In the long Gothic hall there were 50 or 60 men at either side of the long trestled tables in the candlelight, their rifles slung over their shoulders. The hall seemed to tremble with the flickering of the candles, and tusked and antlered heads peered down from the half-darkness as even they couldn't believe what they were seeing. Suddenly, a young man sprang on a table with a rifle in his hand, and he sang." And O'Connor published that nearly 50 years actually after his time in Ashfield Towers. Spirits seem to be high and so on. There is no talk of low morale or lack of food, so how realistic O'Connor's description is of course open to question. There's an image here of National Army troops at ease in Bruff around the 27th or so of July 1922, and the photographer was W.D. Hogan, a Dublin photographer. And Hogan had been commissioned to record events during the Civil War from a pro-treaty perspective. He was embedded, I suppose is the term we'd use now, with the National Army. So his work, his photographs, usually portrayed either destruction caused by the anti-treaty IRA or National Army success. And frequently in his photographs, civilians are present, including youngsters who seem drawn to the camera often. And that's important from a propaganda viewpoint. All the subjects tend to be supportive, or to look supportive of the National Army. Now, there's quite a candid quality to this image, I would suggest. The local children are there, they're playing, they've become accustomed perhaps by this stage to a heavy military presence in their town. They seem unperturbed, they're engaged in their own games. There is the boy in the right foreground. He seems conscious of Hogan. But these are the type of photos that appeared in the press, in the Irish Independent, for instance, the pro-treaty Irish Independent at the time. So they're very useful, they tell us a lot, but we do treat them, or we should treat them, as propaganda shots, essentially. On the subject of civilians, the level of public backing, of public support that had allowed the IRA to surmount, to overcome its shortcomings in technology and resources during the War of Independence in 1919, 20, 21, as they fought Crown forces, well, that level of support was no longer present in 1922, 23. And the anti-treaty IRA often didn't have enough access to food, to money, or any ready source of credit. So they had to commandeer supplies from civilians, they had to impose levies and so on, and that caused antagonism, and it undermined what support there was for them, or prevented support emerging. So their own supporters were strained then quite heavily. And the fact that the National Army was funded by the provisional government thanks to a line of credit essentially from the Bank of Ireland. All of that meant it could purchase supplies, and this gave it a clear advantage over the anti-treaty IRA, especially when it came to dealing with civilians. So when the National Army did arrive in a town like Bruff in these kind of circumstances pictured here, they were very often welcomed by shopkeepers and so on. This image is taken in Bruff, on the main street in Bruff, probably the 26th of July or so. So as I mentioned earlier, Bruff and Brewery, they changed hands repeatedly until the National Army finally secured them in the last days of July. And it's at this point, in early August, that the National Army opens up a second front to the rear of the Munster Republic, and troops land from the sea near Tralee on the 2nd of August. And this plays on local loyalties, and the Kerry anti-treatyites in South Limerick, well, they prioritised the defence of the kingdom over the Munster Republic. They rush home to Kerry to help, basically. And the Cork men around Kilmallock, the Cork contingent, they also slip away. They correctly anticipate the southern coastal attack, the attack on the coast of Cork that materialises a week or so later. So Kilmallock is now badly exposed to the National Army, and that National Army holds a semicircular line around the town from Brewery in the west, past Drummond in the north, through Bulgadin, onto Riversfield House in the southeast. And the plan of attack emphasised this is the large-scale coordinated move on Kilmallock, August 4th, August 5th. The plan of attack emphasises the importance of the four hills that surround and that overlook Kilmallock. So you've Knoxuna Hill, it's 2 miles to the west, it's overlooking the Lubra River and the road to Charleville. That's recognised as being important. But Ash Hill to the southwest, Kilmallock Hill directly to the north, and also Quarry Hill to the northeast, they're prioritised because they dominate the town. So the remaining Republicans, that's the men who haven't gone already to Cork or to Kerry, they evacuate in the face of Free State artillery. The National Army marches into Kilmallock, unopposed actually, on the 5th of August, so there's no final battle for Kilmallock as such. There was a simultaneous pro-treaty thrust westwards, and the towns of Adair, Rathkeil, Newcastle West, they're all taken in the following days. And within 2 weeks of the fall of Kilmallock, the National Army has assumed unchallenged control of every significant population centre really in North Munster, as well as Cork City. And the decisive fixed position fare of the Civil War of late June, July, early August, it degenerates then into really a lingering, an excruciating guerrilla campaign on the part of the IRA, a counter-insurgency campaign on the part of the National Army and the Free State. Here we have an image of the National Army advancing westwards from Kilmallock after securing the town. So the retreating IRA has attempted to sabotage this bridge. It's been partially successful. The army is moving its 18-pounder field gun using a vehicle, using a trailer that they have commandeered, had to commandeer. So this is a fairly typical scene of the second half, the guerrilla stage of the war. Here we have another Hogan photo from this part of County Limerick, probably from the 25th of July in this instance. You see National Army medics treating a wounded soldier. There were, of course, a number of casualties on both sides during the battle for Kilmallock. Here we have another Hogan photo from the Bruffbury Kilmallock area, in this instance from the 22nd of July or so. With his hand to his head is a Republican, an anti-treatyite IRA man who has been captured, who's been taken prisoner by the National Army. Now, there's no suggestion in this instance that anything untoward happened, but this is the kind of circumstance that more frequently as the war dragged on, led to atrocities. There had been an initial reluctance to fight a civil war, but that was replaced in many quarters by a growing mutual antipathy. And that manifested itself in ever more vicious blows and counter blows, and a pattern of vindictive reprisals and of tit-for-tat killings, really. Some of them judicial, more of them extrajudicial. All of that scarred the winter of 1922 into the spring of 23. And the worst of those atrocities occurred in areas where the guerrilla campaign was most determined. So in counties Tipperary, Cork, Kerry, all of those counties saw sharply rising death tolls. But in Limerick, however, there were few deaths in combat after early August 1922 and fewer cold-blooded killings, whether extrajudicial assassinations or judicial executions. And civil war deaths in Limerick in 1923 were actually in single figures, and most of those were accidentally self-inflicted by National Army soldiers. There was really no sustained guerrilla campaign in Limerick, and that was for a number of reasons. Firstly, you had the withdrawal of the Cork and Kerry anti-treaty IRA units, and they had done much of the fighting in the county. They went back to their home areas, to their home counties. Secondly, you had the fact that there was a large National Army garrison in Limerick City, and that was commanded by the impressive Donogh O'Callaghan, who had been one of the most successful flying column commanders of the war. He was in East Limerick. Lastly, you had the fact that anti-treaty IRA columns from Limerick eventually drifted into other counties. So if we just consider for a moment the situation in early to mid-August 1922 after the fall of Kilmallock. So as I said, within 2 weeks of that development, the National Army was in control of pretty much every significant village and town in North Munster. It also held Cork City. Despite all of that, despite the fact that every decisive battle in the Civil War had by this point of mid-August 1922 already been fought and been won exclusively by the National Army, still the war dragged on for another 9 months or so. If you want to learn anything more about the Battle for Kilmallock, I've written about it previously in Limerick, the Irish Revolution, 1912 to 23, published by Four Courts Press, and also from Mercier Press, a book dedicated to the Battle for Kilmallock, and that's been reissued recently. So thank you very much for your time.